Buenos días, tardes o noches, no sabemos cuándo lo vean. Bienvenidos a un episodio más de AnatoVerso, escuchando las voces del cuerpo. En esta ocasión tenemos un episodio muy especial. Tenemos a un invitado, al doctor David Morton de la Universidad de Utah, que vamos a platicar un poco sobre la enseñanza de anatomía, cómo ha cambiado a lo largo de estos años y también las nuevas estrategias y herramientas que que se enfrentan a los estudiantes al momento de aprender. Y pues como siempre, no estamos aquí yo, el doctor Adrián Verdines y el doctor
Rodrigo, Terán.
Ok, y empezamos.
So, first of all, David, thank you. If I may, David.
Yes, David, please.
Thank you for being here. I mean, it's a great opportunity for us. As many of our viewers will know, so the main thing, just getting it out of the way, it's you are the author of the book that we currently use. So that kind of makes you sort of an academic rock star among the students, But
Academic rock star, if that's even a word. But yes, thank you.
I think it's a word, But and hence we want to have a little bit of a conversation about your experience and both your past. How did you get into this, and what happened the day that you said, I'm gonna make this book and I'm gonna do it this way, that way or this way or whatever, So I guess first of all, because a lot of our viewers maybe don't know about it, like if you could tell us, like how did you end up teaching anatomy? What was the road that took you there?
So my dad was an artist. My dad was an artist. He actually did art in high school, and then he dropped out of high school, and then he went to art school, and then he went back and he got a degree because, I'm making this a longer story. My dad was an artist, so we'll put there. So one of the things my dad did in art school was he had a Gray's Anatomy textbook.
Okay.
So
the Gray's Anatomy, the first one, or the original, or
it was actually, now that I know that, I didn't know then, it was the American Gray's Anatomy, not the British Gray's, but the American Gray's Anatomy. It's like this rectangular one, really thick, same art from Henry Van Dyke, but it was published in the States. It was a smaller version. My dad used it because in art school, he did all sorts of form illustration. So when I was a teenager, we had Encyclopedia Britannica, which was like the Google of the day, except there was like lots of these really heavy books. So I would look through those, and there was Gray's Anatomy. And all through my teenage years, I'd pull it and I'd look through it. I was very intrigued by this. So I go to college. I'm thinking I want to go into medicine. My roommate says, hey, if you want to go into medicine, you got to take anatomy. Yeah. And I thought, I took anatomy in high school, and I got a C-. True story. And so I'm like, I don't know if I want to take anatomy. And so, but he said, you really ought to take anatomy. And I did my first semester of university, and I fell in love with it. And so really from that time, from my dad's Gray's Anatomy textbook, which he gave to me before he passed away, to me taking it in college and then saying, that's what I want to do the rest of my life.
Okay. And do you still have it?
I do. It's on my bookshelf in my office at the University of Utah.
Okay, that's a pretty nice story. Many people don't know the original Gray's Anatomy book, since Gray, the book by Richard Drake came out. Many people think when you talk about Gray, we talk about that, but there's also the OG, sort of, in that sense. Yeah. And why when you were studying, in college, how was it? How did you learn anatomy? How was the class?
It was a very traditional lecture. Someone would lecture, and I don't think I remember one thing in college from lecture, but lab, that was the difference, because we had a cadaver-based anatomy lab. So every week we would do some different thing of anatomy, and there was a long structure list, and that's how I learned my anatomy, was from a cadaver donor. And then I started teaching in the lab, and that's really when and so part of the way I did get into it is I took anatomy, and I struggled in university. I was a B- student. I really did struggle. And any element that I find that helps me be a good teacher is I still remember, I always remember what it's like to sit in class and not know what's going on. Okay. So because I remember that, it helps me to construct questions to help students understand something. The way I realized I had a little bit of a knack for that is I would take, my lab was on a Tuesday, And then the following Tuesday, we would have a quiz. So I knew that during the week, students had lab on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So I would go to open lab purposely on those 3 days to sit down with someone who's sitting by a cadaver or sitting with the bones and they didn't know what was going on. I'd say, hey, can I study with you? And I would teach them. And that's how it solidified, was teaching the anatomy.
Okay. So you learned a lot of it through teaching.
See.
That's what where you're getting at.
Well, we have another question, because when someone starts to read the book, or it's common they don't read the prologue, but we read the prologue. And you say something interesting in that, because you use the word that make it easy. So it make this easy with instructions, and easy instructions to the student to find. For example, in your example, you say when you give some directions, you use a specific direction, or specific orders to get the point. But when anatomists teach or give you the directions, it says describe first the room, then the street, then the colors of the street. And how do you think in this product affects the rest of the book? How to teach it?
Yeah, so first, thanks for reading the prologue. Really, thank you. I mean, I spent a lot of time on that, and that was the that analogy I had, because so many textbooks, so many anatomy textbooks are so descriptive that by the time I'm done reading it, I'm still not sure what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
So that analogy that I use about getting directions is they're so specific about how to get from A to B that an anatomist has not really gone, even like the analogy as you were just saying, going from my office to a restaurant. I'd say you stand up and your chair is made of this, and the carpet is this thread count, and the table is this far off the ground, it's made of this material, and it's this thick in diameter, and you walk towards the door, which is 3 feet, and the door is this high, and it's this thick, and there's so many descriptions, you're like, I just need to get to the restaurant. How do I get to the restaurant? There's too many instructions. So the idea of the big picture came from me being very visual. My dad being an artist, and I did art as well, and I had so many drawings. My very first textbook I published was a dissection guide that actually became a Gray's Anatomy. It was called Gray's Dissection Guide for Human Anatomy. And it was, so it became, in its second edition, became a Gray's, and all of those are my drawings. And so the editor is like, hey, do you got any other ideas for your pictures? I said, I picture a textbook that's got lots of big pictures, literally. Figuratively, it's beside the concept in big picture, so that you could open up the page spread, and on the left-hand side would be the instructions, and on the right-hand side would be a big illustration. And this is how and that would be the way. And if there's ever words that spill over to another page, we either delete them or we just make a new page spread. It would always be this way. So Bo Foreman, who's a physical therapist at the University of Utah, and he and I were actually grad students together, and our mentor was Kurt Albertine, who was in Department of Pediatrics, and he was the course director in medicine before me. The three of us put this book together. And so that was the idea of big pictures, big pictures, text.
Yeah, so in that sense, you know, when you're teaching anatomy, it doesn't need to be descriptive, you know, fully morphological descriptions, you know, topographical, you know, because in the end, the clinician he or she doesn't need that in the end. Many times, I mean, sometimes yes, but then you have books to search that upon.
Yeah.
But many times, you know, and something we were talking about, like how important is it to teach a student XY concept with full details versus XY concept simplified? I mean, on the long run, which one is he gonna remember? You know, the full description with, you know, like 3 paragraphs about a bone, or the short and sweet version of maybe 1 paragraph or 3 lines, you know, and then when he has a patient in front, he will remember that. Maybe not
When you heard the older or the senior teachers of anatomy,
See.
you heard the stories about how they need to learn,
memorize
the book entirely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in these times when you see the new generations have different forms of have this information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to that point too. So one other little thing on that is that I'll hear professors say, but they have to know everything. What happens if they go and they'll say into surgery, or what happens if they do this? I'm thinking, it's not a surgery textbook, and a first or second year medical student still is trying to figure out what they need, and so anatomy is meant to help them in physiology, in imaging, and in any other, in clinical scenarios. So the anatomy, it's not necessarily, you have to know everything about every bone, like you said, the basis of it, so that they can remember, like a scaffolding, like a bookshelf, that they can put the rest of their clinical anatomy or clinical knowledge on.
And how does clinical reasoning fit into the whole big picture thing? Because in the book, there's sometimes the anatomical description, and then XYZ clinical a scenario. Like, oh, if you hurt this nerve, if it gets, then this happens. So how does clinical reasoning teaching how can it be applied in anatomy?
Okay.
In that context, because like you said, they're just first year, second year, maybe.
Yeah.
Sometimes, I mean, they're not surgeons, they're not internal medicine or whatever. But how do you teach clinical in the basic sciences? That's what I'm getting.
So I think of anatomy like a language, like any language that you would learn. And in any language, you have a group of words that you know the word and its translation, and then conjugation of verbs in past, present, and future tense. No matter what language you learn, that's the case. And so when we were talking previously to this about how when I took my Italian class, and it was a hard class, but it was hard because they tested us on speaking, but we didn't practice. And they had so many words. And what I took away from that is when anatomy is, instead of teaching 5,000 terms, I'm a good listener, and I listen to clinicians for 25 years as an educator, and I know that they don't need the 5,000 anatomy words. They need this. Okay. Then that's what I require students to learn before they even come to class. Almost like saying, hey, we're going to talk about how to get to a library. I want you to learn these 25 words and these 5 verbs and conjugate them. So when you come to class, we're going to practice. Because they can do that at home. They could sit there and memorize a list. Anatomy is the same. So instead of saying, I'm going to sit here and lecture on all the bones and bony landmarks of the scapula and the humerus, and then I'm going to teach you all the muscles of the brachium and antebrachium and the branches of the brachioplexus, while you sit, instead say, here's a subset of the bones and bony landmarks and the muscles and the innervation. Come to class ready with that. And then we'll use clinical scenarios. So if someone's cognitive load, our brains can only handle so much information. So if you have a 1-hour class, and I imagine them, pouring information into a cup, and the cup is getting higher and higher, and we're pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring. At the very end, we're like, let's do a clinical scenario. It's already overrunning the top. Yeah. So instead, I say, here it is, and they fill their cup the night before. So when they come, we're now starting where they've still got room in that cup. And that's when the clinical scenarios where they can practice, and they can practice applying that information. That's when they remember.
Okay.
What are the main challenges you face with this form of teaching anatomy? Where do you find the resistance when the students were your peers, or where?
I always thought the resistance would come from the students, and it never does. The resistance doesn't come from the students. The resistance comes from professors who think that there is no other way except lecture. And I'm not against lecture. I think often in medical school, lecture is a dirty word and you should not do it. And I think a lecture is the most efficient way of delivering information. And if the goal is just to deliver information, there's a time and a place for that. However, if the goal is to help students apply the information and solve problems, Lecture's not the tool. It's not the vehicle to do that. And I have found that medical students in the early, especially the early stages, have this mindset that, well, in 2 years, I'll be a doctor.
Yeah. Okay.
As opposed, and so they're like, I guess I'll solve problems then, because we sit there and we just talk to them. By involving them in the learning process and by saying, instead of saying, wait to solve problems, we're like, let's do it now. And what I found is that when you show a problem in class, I might as well not even be there, because I can start talking and they're like, get out of the way. We're leading this question and they're trying to solve the problem. And then you allow them. I do this thing called think, pair, share. And think, pair, share is you show a problem and they think about it. They pair up with their neighbor. They talk for a few minutes. And then I say, who would like to talk? And then I call on someone and they share in front of the class. So they've had a chance to think about the question. They've talked about it as a small group. And now they share in front of their peers. And students are not the resistance. Often it's other faculty or administration that doesn't understand this. And still, it's surprising the number of professors who don't involve the students in the learning process. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it's because we observe that so many scenarios in when the teachers or the students are or who is it, the guys?
Or their peers, the new peers,
have some resistance to teach in this new form, because they are they're learning the old-fashioned way, and they think that's the correct way. Mm-hmm. So this my question is about that. Yes.
Yeah, and to that point too. So one of the challenges that is when students don't like to talk in front of their peers, like here in Monterrey. How many students were in that first class? Like 500 or 600, something like that. Yeah, like so that's nerve-wracking. And so that's why when people say, well, Dave, you can do this with, because we have usually 100 to 125 students, you can do that because it's a smaller group. If you do it right, it doesn't matter the number of students. In fact, whenever I talk about it, I always use Monterrey as an example, because there's 600 students. You're like, you can't do active learning with 600. I'm like, if you do think, pair, share, they think about the question, they pair up with their neighbor, and whether or not they share in front of 600 people or not, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
They've had a chance to talk about the question with their neighbor, and then people who feel a little bit more comfortable will raise their hand and share it. So that is, at that point, I never force a student to talk in front of that many people. And they're like, well, they're going to have to do that in medicine. I'm like, I don't know of many doctors who are doing rounds in a hospital with 600 people following them. You just don't have that. So I don't force anyone, because I don't know how to make the perfect environment for students, but I do know how to wreck the perfect environment. Okay. And that is embarrass a student and make them look stupid in front of their peers. That just never works in building the feeling of safety. Like, I can raise my hand, and even if it's wrong, it's going to
Yeah, and in that way, it's part of the teaching experience and the both experience and responsibility, because if you already know the answers, you can always make harder questions. I mean, you can eventually get to a point where you're going to ask the question that they don't know, and just because they don't know a question, it doesn't mean that they are going to fail the exam or that they're not going to be good doctors or anything. I mean, it just means that they don't know that question. As a follow-up, how do you encourage, for example, when you read your book, for example, like the big pictures and description. So do you think there's a role to play with, if there is, which with 3D models or, virtual reality and all of this new technology, like, because I've always been fearful of it, because I'm not sure if having more tools would translate into having a better teaching and learning experience, because in the end, tools are, tools. It depends on how you use them. How do you feel about this new mechanics? Simulators,
virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, 3D models and printing, all of that, right? So I like how you use the word a tool, because there's two elements of it. Is that you could say to a mechanic, how does it feel to be a mechanic when there's so many tools? Or carpenter, and you think, well, they become a carpenter because they learn how to use each tool the way they're meant to be used. And so as an educator, like I've had people say this to this, when people say, lecture is bad. And when I hear that, I'm like, it's just incorrect, because it's just a tool.
Okay.
So just like if you think of a hammer, you know, you get the wood part and the metal thing at the top, and someone says, hey, how do you put this nail into the piece of wood? You go, well, it's easy. You do it like this, and you go hammer. But what happens is someone were to pick up a hammer by the metal, so that the wood thing's sitting out, and they're like, and it's not working, they'll say, hammer is a bad tool. No. The hammer's not a bad tool. You're just not using it right. So what happens then, and I see this when they say, well, is lecture a bad tool? It's usually said by someone who's using a hammer poorly.
Oh, okay.
Right? So now we come to this art, but what about virtual reality? Virtual reality is just a screwdriver. It's just another tool, or augmented reality, or 3D models, or artificial intelligence, or a plethora of other types of teaching tools. It's how we use them is really the question. Like I would say the cadaver is the #1 teaching tool for human anatomy, but I've been to labs where they use them poorly. The lab's set up bad, and people are like, oh, it doesn't work. Ultrasound, oh, that's the way to go. And I've seen some programs use ultrasound so well that students know their anatomy through ultrasound better than some students use cadavers.
Okay. Yeah.
But I've been to many programs around the world that use ultrasound, and it's not used, it's done poorly, so students get messed up in the technology, and it's not a good educational tool. So I'm not fearful of anything that comes out thinking, oh, is it going to make either me as a professor obsolete? Like if you take a look at artificial intelligence, you think, is it going to be, am I going to be out of a job because now an AI could do this? It's just yet another tool.
Okay.
It's not new. When TVs came out for the first time, televisions came out, there was the idea our teacher's going to be obsolete because look, there's a television.
Yeah.
And then you're like, and then the internet comes. Oh, the internet's going to be, our teacher's going to be irrelevant. Oh no. And now you're recording lectures. Our teacher's going to be irrelevant. And then AI comes. Our teacher's going to be. What happens is every technology will take a facet, and as long as we use it well, teachers are never going to be obsolete. You will always need experts to take complex information. That's why you're like, I'm blabbing, aren't I? I'm going on too far. So one more thing on this.
Go on.
Like I'm trying to learn Spanish and Italian. My mom's Italian. I'm trying to be better with Spanish. So I have a bunch of apps, and I'm using artificial intelligence. And guess what? I'm still struggling. Because at some point, I got to sit down, and I just have to memorize a whole group of terms and a whole group of, verbs, and being able to conjugate this. Anatomy, some point, someone has to sit down and they just have to memorize certain terms. And whether AI helps them or VR helps them or not, they have to memorize them at some point.
Yeah. And we go back to that example about conversation, because you can learn the terms, but if you don't know how to apply them to a clinical case, and in the end, we always say like, oh, an exam doesn't define you, but in the end, most countries in the world, we use standardized testing for medical students. I mean, I don't know the statistic, but I would put it higher than 90% of medical school grades come from standardized tests, some sort of or form, and we need to teach them, how to solve the problems also, not just memorize things. And a lot of students are like, they got the idea that anatomy, it's a boring subject because you just gotta memorize a bunch of body parts and everything. And it's like, well, you have to do some of that. You do have to do some of that. But in the end, as a medical student, you need to solve problems. So that's why you need to learn anatomy. It's not just to know the body parts. It's to know the body parts in order to solve problems.
And students, medical students particularly, they get better at whatever they practice. They do. And if we practice them just memorizing, they'll become really good at memorizing. And that's where they don't love it, because they're just memorizing for the sake of memorizing. If you then give them problems to solve, you accomplish both. They get better at the memorizing, and they become better at solving problems, which is what the end goal is for all these med students.
In this context, how do you see the future of the anatomy education in the next 10, 20 years? How do you see that?
Yeah, so when the pandemic happened, there was a whole thrust into virtual and augmented reality because people were now, for the lecture, those who do active learning, it didn't change as much because whether you're interacting with students in a classroom or through a Zoom meeting virtually, there are things that are different, of course. You're not there face-to-face, but you were able to accomplish it. Yeah. But what about hands-on lab, where you're putting on gloves and you're with a cadaver donor, things like that. So there's a big thrust for virtual and augmented reality, and I still believe there is. We're not there. We're not close to that yet. I'm being able to find a model that can have parity with using a cadaver. So I would say that is one area that I'm looking to see where the puck goes. That's a hockey term. Where I'm looking to where the future is going with regards to virtual and augmented reality, where an individual could be in this house and in this house, and they're both working on the same, in a sense, cadaver donor, but it's a virtual donor. That's one area that I see going. There's a lot that does with 3D printing, and I don't see any difference between 3D printing and having models or you holding a skull. All of them is you have some three-dimensional object that you're manipulating with your hands to be able to study. So I don't look at that and think there's anything big and novel. Artificial intelligence, I'm curious to see how that is going to play out. Okay. And it's still a relatively
It's relatively new, but we use this a lot in these years. You can see the students use in these methods of learning, and not only in the text or making a text or making a abstract or something. You can see they used to have a picture, to have illustrations, to have podcasts, but it's evolving very fast.
Yeah, and that takes me to my next question. What's your experience with media? Because you have a YouTube channel about anatomy and everything. And how do you think that? I mean, first of all, I guess you like it because otherwise you wouldn't have it. But how do you feel? How did that idea came up? How did you end up doing the channel?
So again, we take a look at this idea of a tool. So YouTube's been around for a long time, and I actually don't pretend to be the most up to like when it comes to technology, being on the cutting edge of using it, but I felt like I had grown as an educator to a point where I wanted to do more interacting with my students in class. I wanted to solve problems, so I started doing this flipped classroom, which is now what we call it. In like 2007, 2008, I started doing more of that. And so for 5 years, I would lecture and do an interactive problem. Lecture, interactive problem. And I said, what would I have to do to just do the entire 1 hour class, just problems? I'm like, they're going to need to watch a lecture beforehand. Yeah. And I could not find what I wanted on YouTube. Okay. So I started making my own videos. And I actually didn't put them on YouTube. I just put them on our learning management system, and it got too clunky. And the students started saying, can't you just put those on YouTube? And that's when I started putting them on YouTube. Okay. To this point, then again, about a tool, is that there's now thousands, if not more, of different videos on YouTube for anatomy. There's lots and lots. So to say videos are the solution, I'm like, well, that's just a tool. And I try to make a tool that is helpful for students because there's a lot of videos. And so videos, I think, are very good. Students can stop, rewind, and pause and look up words if they're thinking, oh, I don't remember what the word fascia means. I can't remember what collagen is. And what does abducens mean again? And they can pause and look it up, where in class they can't go, wait, look this up, continue, let me rewind. Now this is boring. I'm going to fast forward at double speed. So they can manipulate the material that way.
Yeah, it's a great tool because I watched some of the videos and and the lecture you gave today with the students. I I really think, there's always been this theory in medical, well, in education in general, that some people are more like visual, and then some people are more auditory, and then, me personally, where I'm standing is, I think there's some truth to that, but I think we change with time. I don't think I learned the same way I learned in my first year medical school, or the third year, or by the end. I think it went, it changed, and like you said, it just, having the videos and the 3D printing, or virtual reality and everything, it just creates the right environment so that they can thrive in the way that they need. And that's like the real job of the teacher, I think. Like, how do I create that environment for my student? And
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there's a we don't have at our school, we do not have mandatory attendance. Students can come to a lecture or a classroom if they want to.
Okay.
So part of the element, to your point, to your question earlier about if there's people who give pushback. So medical students vote with their feet. If they look at something, they find it helpful and they're learning, they will come.
Yeah.
If they don't find it helpful, since we record all of our classroom sessions, they'll just watch it later. And so when I do a flipped classroom, we get a lot of students that come because they vote with their feet as something that is helpful. And one of the reasons I believe it is that we talk about in medicine, evidence-based medicine continually. And then there's a scientific lab. We don't say evidence-based science because it's just it's science. It should be evidence-based. So we talk about evidence-based doing research and science, evidence-based medicine. Why is it that we don't hear a lot of evidence-based education?
yes,
And so when I do flipped classroom, I'm just incorporating evidence-based principles, retrieval, spacing, interleaving are these three things that students learn something ahead of time, and then they retrieve it from their memory. And then you space it. You have them retrieve a memory that they learned from a previous class.
Yeah.
Spacing. And then interleaving is taking two similar related concepts that students have to figure out
how to.
how to take them apart.
In place,
Yeah, and so students get better
Yeah.
at what they practice. If you continually have them retrieving, spacing, and interleaving in their brains, they get better at that. And that's one of the reasons I think that I've had some elements of success in classes I participated in, because I'm continually just adding evidence-based educational principles to what we do.
Okay.
Well, I guess we could stay here, talking for quite a while, but I think everything you've just told us gives us a better vision of how to go forward, to get better, to improve with our students at the center, how to teach them more. Do you have any and that's what I want to ask, a more sort of like a work related but also personal question.
bet.
Do you have any experiences with students, like that you can tell us about, that were meaningful to you, like something about because I think when you're studying whatever you do, you always have good teachers, and teachers you remember, and teachers who you look up to, no? So have you ever had any good memory?
Oh, so many. Something that just came to mind is when I was a student, when I was a graduate student. So Kurt Albertine was my mentor. He's the senior author on the Big Picture book. And so I remember right in the beginning of graduate school, in the first year or two of graduate school, I was getting ready for a lecture, my first lecture that I was going to give. So it was at 7:00 at night. He had me come to the classroom that I'd be lecturing. He sat at the very back, I'm at the front. He says, "All right, David, give the lecture." And he sat there, he had his notepad, and he's taking notes. And I gave the lecture, and he says, "All right, come back." And I sat down, and he went through and he told me, do this, and have you considered this and the problem? And he goes, "Do it again." And I got up, and I kind of felt a little hurt by it, because there was some harsh criticism. And so we did it a couple of times, and I remember leaving and being a little hot under the collar. And so I've learned to listen to the voice that talks to me in my head when it talks. And it was like, do you realize how busy he is? And you recognize what time it is? And you recognize what he's doing for you right now? And it was like, learn as much as you can from him. when you have him, because he won't always be there. And so that is an element that I've tried to see in teaching, is that it's important to be encouraging to students, and it's important to give them the feedback that they need. And so I find that, as I've tried to do this as an educator now, like I think back, he was really busy and he was doing a whole lot, and he took the time at those nights, and it wasn't the only time he did it either, where he spent the time and gave me frank feedback. And as educators, one of the things I find is to help give feedback and constructive, and yet make sure a student doesn't leave without some correction and they need that will help them in their career, whether it's a piece of knowledge or a way of thinking about a problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, David, it's been quite the trip, quite the conversation. We're really happy to have you here. This is your home, and we appreciate everything you've told us, and the stories and your opinions. We hope to have you back someday, not that far away, but thank you so much, because I think it's going to help us a lot, to get better at what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve down here.
Thank you both very much.
Okay.
Bueno, y esto fue este episodio de AnatoVerso. Le recordamos también que nos sigan en nuestras redes sociales, en Instagram, en el Instagram del Departamento de Anatomía, nuestro canal de YouTube y en Spotify. Sería todo.
Nos vemos.
Nos vemos.